Lily left food at the doorstep, but a hand snatched the bag and vanished into the darkness. The next day, the neighbors opened the door and froze. On the floor sat an exhausted boy. "Who are you?" In response, only tears. Then the horrifying truth was revealed. In a small American suburb, where mornings always began with the scent of freshly cut grass and the quiet chatter of neighbors, lived 9-year-old Lily Watson. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where identical Christmas lights were hung each year, and where summer picnics were a cherished tradition. Nothing unexpected ever really happened here, except perhaps for Mrs. Jenkins once again scolding someone for leaving a bicycle by her gate. Lily was an ordinary girl, quiet, a little shy, but with a uniquely bright smile. Her light brown hair was always neatly braided into 2 plaits, and her eyes held a soft, kind glow. She didn't run through the streets like other children, didn't shout or wave her hands. Lily was the kind of girl who always walked at a steady pace, as if she knew something important that no one else did. Every morning, at the same time, she left her house, clutching a brown paper bag to her chest. Sometimes, the outlines of a container or foil-wrapped sandwiches could be seen inside. Step by step, she made her way down the street toward a house that everyone had long considered abandoned. It stood at the very end of the road, slightly apart from the other homes. Its walls were coated in a layer of gray grime, the paint had peeled away, and the curtains in the crooked windows had long since disintegrated with time. The wooden porch creaked even under the lightest breeze, and the mailbox had been empty for so many years that wasps had made a home inside. But Lily wasn't afraid. She carefully placed the bag on the doorstep, knocked 3 times, and walked away without ever looking back. The neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. In a town where even a new curtain on a window sparked discussion, such a strange ritual could not go unnoticed. "She must be feeding a homeless person," sighed Mrs. Wallace, watching the girl from behind her curtains. "Or maybe someone is blackmailing her," whispered the young hairdresser from the corner salon. "What if she believes a ghost lives there?" "Kids believe all sorts of things," chuckled Mr. Clark as he adjusted his belt. But they all agreed on one thing. That house had been empty for years. No one lived there. No one had stepped out of its doors. No light had shone in its windows. And yet, every morning, Lily brought food there. Night in the small town always fell quickly, draping the streets in the soft glow of streetlights. This time, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't sleep. Her mind was occupied with Lily Watson's strange habit. Every day, that girl brought food to a house that had long been considered abandoned. No one had lived there for years, yet someone was taking the bags she left behind. Someone no one knew about. The next morning, the old neighbor stepped out earlier than usual and took up a watchful position on her porch. She knew Lily would appear precisely at 8. The girl was punctual, like clockwork. And there she was. The same steady yet light footsteps. The same brown paper bag clutched tightly in her hands. Mrs. Jenkins held her breath. Lily reached the abandoned house just as always, placed the bag on the doorstep, knocked 3 times, carefully but clearly. Then, without looking back, she turned and walked away at a brisk pace. The woman waited a few seconds, then stepped closer. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel the pulse in her temples. That house had stood lifeless for years. What if something was really inside? And then, Mrs. Jenkins saw it. A thin, dirty hand, with ragged nails and trembling fingers, slowly slipped out from the narrow gap between the door and the frame. The fingers hesitated for a moment, barely grazing the bag, then snatched it and pulled it inside in an instant. The woman stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch. Her chest tightened, and only one thought flashed through her mind. "There's someone in there." Shocked, she rushed home and immediately told the neighbors everything. Mr. Clark, a sturdy man in his 50s, gathered a small group. No one liked meddling in other people's affairs, but what Mrs. Jenkins had seen was beyond normal. When Lily repeated her morning ritual again, the neighbors, holding their breath, followed her. They hid behind bushes, behind parked cars, watching as the girl knocked 3 times, left the bag, and walked away. As soon as her figure disappeared around the corner, Mr. Clark gave the signal. "It's now or never," he said quietly, and, without giving himself time to hesitate, stepped onto the porch. The others huddled behind him, barely breathing. He threw the door open. A heavy smell of dampness and unwashed skin hit them. Inside it was dark, with only thin slivers of light breaking through the gaps in the curtains. And then they saw him. A boy. He sat on the dirty floor, clutching the paper bag to his chest. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes wide and terrified. His hair was tangled, and his clothes were torn, stained with old dirt. When the door opened, he flinched like a trapped animal and backed away until his spine pressed against the wall. "Who are you?" Mr. Clark asked softly. The boy didn't answer. He just curled into himself and began to cry. The house no longer seemed empty. It was no longer just an old building at the end of the street that no one paid attention to. Now, it was a crime scene. Someone had called the police, and within 15 minutes, the street was flooded with flashing lights. Officers quickly surrounded the house, asking questions, taking names. Mrs. Jenkins still couldn't collect herself, clutching her old cardigan with trembling hands. Mr. Clark stood silently, watching as the medics carried the boy away. Jamie. His name was Jamie. At first, he didn't speak. He just sobbed, clenching his fists and flinching whenever someone moved too fast. But in the ambulance, wrapped in a warm blanket, he finally forced out the truth. He had lived in that house with his father, a man many in town remembered. Kevin Langley, a rough, reclusive man who never greeted anyone and always kept to himself. No one was surprised when he suddenly disappeared, leaving his crumbling house to rot at the edge of town. But it turned out he hadn't just left the house. He had left his son, a boy who had been locked in the basement whenever his father went out. Sometimes for a day, sometimes for a week. Without food, without light, without hope. And then, one morning, the door simply never opened. His father left and never came back. Jamie waited. A day. 2. A week. When it became clear that he was alone, he made his way upstairs. The house was empty. Cold. Terrifying. He searched for food, but found only bare cupboards. He searched for water, but nothing had come from the faucet in a long time. Jamie was certain that no one cared about him, that no one would remember he existed, and no one did. No one. Except for one girl. "I felt sorry for him. I saw him through the window," Lily whispered when an officer asked her a question. Her voice trembled. Her mother stood beside her, holding her shoulders, but Lily didn't try to hide behind her. She stared at the floor, biting her lip. He was crying. He was all alone. She looked up, and in her eyes was deep, genuine pain. "I felt sorry for him." The officer nodded, jotting down her words in his notebook, but Lily didn't see it. She was remembering the day she had accidentally noticed a thin face through the shattered window, remembering the terrified eyes that peeked out at the street before disappearing again, remembering how she hadn't been able to sleep that night, because she knew someone was in that house. How, the next morning, she had taken a piece of bread from the fridge, wrapped it in a napkin, and, shaking with fear, left it at the door. How 2 days later, she found the napkin, empty. And how, from that moment on, She had brought food every single day, because she knew, if she didn't, he would die. The neighbors were silent. All these years they had lived next door, walked past that house, seen it, but never wondered why it was so quiet. Never thought to check if someone might be inside. No one had noticed the boy starving to death just meters away from their perfectly kept lawns. Mrs. Jenkins, curled up in on herself, whispered, "My God, how did we not see it?" But there was no answer. Mr. Clark clenched his fists. What kind of bastard? How could he just leave him? Everyone knew who he was talking about. The man who was now nowhere to be found. The man who had one day simply walked away, shut the door behind him, and left his son to die, and no one knew where he was now. The police car pulled away smoothly, taking Jamie away from his past. He didn't look back, maybe because he knew there was nothing left there anymore. They told him that everything would be different now, that a safe home, proper meals, and a clean bed awaited him. But Jamie didn't know how to believe that. He had lived in the shadows for so long that the sunlight streaming through the car window felt foreign, unreal. For a long time, Lily wasn't allowed to see him. She kept asking, her mother, the neighbors, even the officer who had written down her words in his notebook. But every time she heard the same answer, "It's better for him this way." But what if he was alone again? What if no one came to leave food at his doorstep anymore? Weeks passed, then months. Life returned to normal. School, walks, the smiles of other children on the street. But only Lily knew that her world would never be the same. And then, news spread through the neighborhood. The Clark family had taken Jamie in. It was one of those rare stories that, when they happen, make people stop and think. This time the Clarks hadn't looked the other way. They couldn't. One evening, Lily was walking down the street when she saw a familiar figure standing by their gate. It was him, Jamie. But now he was clean, well-groomed, dressed in new clothes, his hair neatly trimmed. And most importantly, he was smiling. "Thank you for not leaving me," he said, looking straight into her eyes. Lily gazed at him, feeling a deep sense of relief tighten in her chest. He wasn't alone anymore. She smiled back and, for the first time, said out loud what she had carried in her heart for so long. "Family isn't something you leave behind, even if it's not yours." At that moment, the neighbors watching them seemed to see something more than just two children. They saw a child who had been kinder than all the adults combined.